Hello and welcome to another CHSG History revision video. This one focuses on your superpower relations paper, and it's all about the period of increased tension between 1980 and 1985, known as the Second Cold War. Let's begin by putting this period into the bigger picture. When historians refer to the Second Cold War, they're referring to a period of intense superpower rivalry between 1980 and 1985. Now, this period comes directly after a decade of superpower cooperation during Dayton, and it's followed after 1985 by the collapse of the Soviet Union. Here you can see the main events of the Second Cold War, which we'll study in this video. So the Second Cold War began with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979. By this time, détente was already breaking down. There was a sense among American politicians that the Soviet Union had cheated during détente, so President Carter was already looking for a way to end it. This came in Afghanistan. Now, as you can see, Afghanistan was strategically important to the Soviet Union, as it was located on the Soviets' border with Iran and Pakistan. It was also close to the Persian Gulf, an economically important region of the world with major oil shipping routes. Now, the USSR was concerned about the spread of Islamic fundamentalism in this region. Islamic fundamentalists had already taken power during a revolution in Iran, and the Soviets feared that their ideas might spread through Afghanistan into the southern USSR, an area with a mainly Muslim population. Now, the Soviets tried at first to avoid becoming tangled up in Afghanistan, but ultimately they ended up invading. It's worth looking for a moment in detail at the course of events here. Firstly, there was an uprising by the Mujahideen, or Holy Warriors, against the communist government of Afghanistan. These Mujahideen had the support and aid of Iran. Amin, the communist leader of Afghanistan, asked for Soviet help, which Brezhnev initially refused. However, when Amin turned to the USA, Brezhnev feared that Afghanistan might become an American ally. He therefore invaded Afghanistan and replaced Amin with a pro-Soviet leader, Karmal. Once in Afghanistan, the Soviet army had to stay there to help Karmal fight the Mujahideen, who were receiving American funding and weapons. The war became a decade-long struggle for the USSR, draining both its economy to the cost of $200 billion and its military forces. It also gave Carter the reason he was looking for to end détente. Thus, the USA announced a tougher policy towards the USSR, which we'll look at in a moment. In the longer term, the war contributed to a change of leadership in both superpowers. In the USA, it played a role in the election of President Reagan, and in the USSR, it helped bring Gorbachev to power. Let's look next at the Carter Doctrine. As we mentioned a moment ago, by 1980 there was a feeling among both American politicians and the public that the Soviets had cheated during détente. They had broken their promises on human rights, made in the Helsinki Accords, and they had also continued to support communist rebels in the developing world, including in Africa and Central America. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan was the final straw here, as it seemed that the Soviets were seeking to spread their influence over another country using military force. We should also note that at this point there was an election approaching in the USA. The current president, Carter, had been criticised for not being tough enough on America's enemies in the world, so he needed to prove himself as a strong and decisive leader in order to get re-elected. So when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, he announced the Carter Doctrine. This was a tough new approach to the USSR, modelled on the Truman Doctrine of 1947. Carter committed the USA to containing, or stopping the spread of, Soviet influence in the Persian Gulf region. To do this, he raised military spending, and he began sending American military aid to Afghanistan's neighbours and to the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, aiding them in their fight against the Soviet army. Carter also punished the USSR by introducing sanctions, ending exports of vital food, equipment and technology to the Soviet Union. Carter also withdrew the SALT II Treaty on Arms Limitation from Congress, so it was never ratified or signed off, although both sides did continue to stick to the treaty. The Carter Doctrine mattered for the Cold War. Firstly, it had symbolic importance, as it made clear that détente was now over, and the superpowers were once again rivals. Secondly, military aid to the Mujahideen made it harder for the Soviets to win their war in Afghanistan. And this is one reason why the Carter Doctrine increased tensions between the superpowers. It also caused tension by beginning a new round of the arms race. Finally, we should also note that American sanctions harmed the Soviet economy, which was now cut off from accessing some of the US technology which the Soviets needed in order to improve productivity. Later that year, the Olympic Games were scheduled to be held in Moscow in the USSR. Now remember, although the Olympics is a sporting event, it has also been used for political propaganda purposes in the past. The 1980 Olympics were the first to be held in a communist country, and the Soviets saw this as a great opportunity to show off the successes of communism, portraying it as a successful system of government. This contrasted with Carter's goal, which was to prove himself as tough on the Soviets by using the Games to show the world that détente was over and to protest the invasion of Afghanistan. Carter's government announced a boycott of the Games. American athletes were warned that they would have their passports taken if they tried to attend. 60 other countries joined the American boycott, which meant that when the Games happened, many of the world's top athletes were missing. As a result, the Games looked unimpressive. Soviet leaders were furious that their big opportunity had been spoiled. The boycott was important for the USA because it demonstrated how strong and influential the USA was in the world, with so many other countries following the US lead in boycotting the Games. The boycott itself damaged superpower relations, with both sides increasing their propaganda. The Soviets accused the USA of manipulating athletes for political gain, while the Americans depicted the USSR as a cruel dictatorship, denying its people their freedoms. The Soviets went on to hit back at the USA by boycotting the Games 4 years later when they were held in Los Angeles in America. These boycotts showed just how bad the relationship had become. We might also say that the boycotts had a symbolic importance too. For billions of viewers around the world, the boycott symbolised the end of détente. At this point, there was a change of US president during the 1980 election. The election campaign itself happened at a time when many American voters believed that the USA was losing its position as the leading superpower in the world. The USSR appeared to have cheated during détente. Meanwhile, the USA had been humiliated, firstly by its failure to win the Vietnam War, and secondly by the hostage crisis in Iran, during which Carter was humiliated by the failure to free American diplomats who had been taken hostage by Islamic fundamentalists. All this created a sense that the USA needed a tough new leader capable of standing up to America's enemies in the world. When the election happened, Carter was beaten by Reagan, a tough anti-communist whose simple view of the Cold War as a story of good versus evil, and whose promise to get tough on the Soviets appealed to American voters. Reagan's language was provocative, particularly his description of the USSR as an evil empire. Reagan announced that he would raise American military spending to fund new weapons, including cruise missiles and Trident nuclear submarines. Reagan also announced that the USA would give aid to anti-communist rebels in communist countries to help them overthrow their communist governments. This went further than the previous policy of containment, as the USA was now committed to pushing communism out of existing communist countries. US forces even invaded the Caribbean island of Grenada to overthrow the communist government there, which Reagan called the first ever successful rollback of communism. Now, in the short term, Reagan's election did much to increase superpower tensions. His language and increased military spending led to a furious reaction from the Soviets, who branded him insane, a liar, and a warmonger. In the longer term, though, Reagan's policies set off a new arms race, which put the Soviet economy under incredible strain. And this is one factor which brought Gorbachev, a reformer, to power in the Soviet Union, thus leading to the end of the Cold War. And we'll come back to that again in a moment. The next step in Reagan's more aggressive policy towards the USSR was the announcement of SDI in 1983. The Soviet economy at this time was struggling. It lacked advanced technology, so productivity was low. Furthermore, the ongoing war in Afghanistan was draining Soviet finances. Reagan recognised this and wanted to draw the USSR into a new arms race, which might bankrupt the USSR and cause its collapse. It's also worth remembering at this point that the space race between the superpowers, which had been such a feature of their rivalry in the 1950s and 1960s, had been slowed down. Both sides had agreed in the 1967 Outer Space Treaty not to use space for military purposes, and they had even carried out a joint space mission in 1975, with the docking of an American Apollo craft with a Soviet Soyuz module. Reagan took steps to reignite this space and arms race. He announced that the USA would develop the world's first missile shield in space, using a complex system of computers, satellites, and lasers. Although the technology for this did not exist, Reagan spoke as if it did, and thus the Soviets believed him. If completed, SDI would completely change the balance of power between the USA and USSR. The principle of MAD would be ended. The USSR's missiles would be useless if the Americans had a missile shield, and the USSR would be the only superpower vulnerable to a nuclear attack. Now, although SDI never actually happened, it was still important for the Cold War. The immediate impact here was a sharp rise in tension. The Soviets panicked as they lacked the advanced computer technology needed to build such a system. And even if they did have it, with their economy struggling, they could not afford to begin work on an SDI system of their own. Over the longer term, however, SDI had a more positive impact. The new Soviet leader, Gorbachev, recognised that the USSR could not keep up the pace with this arms race, so he focused on improving relations with the USA, and in time, this led to the end of the Cold War. Which brings us to our final event and the end point of the Second Cold War. This is when Gorbachev came to power in the USSR in 1985. In the years running up to this, the USSR had a run of ageing, ineffective leaders like Andropov and Chernenko. These were the last members of the generation who had grown up under Stalin. During their time as leaders, they did not tackle the growing problems of the Soviet Union. So when Gorbachev came into office, the economy was in a terrible state and the USSR was unable to go on competing in the arms race. Now, Gorbachev was younger than his predecessors. Coming from a new generation, he was a reformer with a different approach called New Thinking. This included 4 key elements. Firstly, perestroika, which meant reorganising the economy to allow more capitalist practices, like allowing private businesses to trade. Secondly, glasnost, which meant transparency. In effect, this meant reducing censorship, being more open with the Soviet people and allowing them more freedom of speech. Thirdly, he ended the Brezhnev Doctrine and signalled that satellite states would be allowed to make reforms. Finally, he began military reduction by getting out of the Afghanistan war and entering talks with the USA in order to try and end the arms race. And it was these policies which brought the tension of the Second Cold War to a close. In the West, Gorbachev was seen as the kind of man who could be worked with. Reagan sensed an opportunity to win the Cold War. Thus, summit meetings were held at which Gorbachev and Reagan struck up a good working relationship. Ultimately, this led to arms reduction and an end to the arms race through the INF Treaty, which was signed at the 1987 Washington Summit. Over the longer term, Gorbachev's reforms brought about the end of the Cold War, as they led to the collapse of Soviet rule in Eastern Europe and the eventual breakdown of the USSR itself. While that goes beyond the scope of this video, there is another tutorial all about this on the CHSG History channel. Now is a good opportunity to consolidate what you've learned in this video. Here's a diagram showing 6 key events from the Second Cold War. You should copy and complete it from memory. For each event, try to write down what happened, when, and what impact it had on the Cold War. When you've done what you can from memory, watch the video again, filling in anything you missed. Now you can also follow up this video by having a go at one of these questions. Here you can practice your skill at explaining consequences, analysing importance, or writing a narrative account. Thanks for watching this tutorial. If it was useful, hit the like button and don't forget that there are lots of other Cold War tutorials on the channel. The best way to reach all our latest content is to subscribe.